voucher schools and kids in regular schools. And voucher schemes can subsidize the middle class and wealthier families who already send their children to private schools, gives incentives for more to do so. Voucher schemes can also have very negative social consequences. It's worth noting that the major experiment with voucher schemes in the U.S. was in the 1950s, after Brown versus Board of Education, and in the South, with the response of some school districts which closed their schools and give all children vouchers, which allowed white families to continue the racist behavior of sending their children to white public schools. Only now there were private schools. We can have no confidence in the U.S. or elsewhere that privatized primary and secondary schooling will deliver an education that leads to fairness, justice, democracy, or indeed any other what economists call externalities that are necessary for an efficient and equitable society. The international experience similarly does not come to any great conclusions about vouchers. There have been voucher experiments in Chile, in Colombia, and in a couple of other places, Netherlands, Belgium. But there's no evidence that test scores go up because of vouchers, or if there is evidence that it does, it's disputed by the advocates of vouchers versus the critics of vouchers. So we've got no results that make it clear that vouchers are really a panacea for improving student achievement. Okay, the third area, managerial models. I call this output-based aid, OBA. You sometimes see it as PBA, performance-based assistance. It's not talking about merit pay in particular, that's just one of the modalities. It's talking about tying financing, whether it's international assistance or national distribution of resources, based on performance, based on output, based on outcomes. The central feature of neoliberal rhetoric has been that the delivery of external aid and national government financing for basic social services should be based on success in achieving measurable output. Basing educational funding, evaluation, and policy on the degree to which social services achieve desirable outcomes appears on its surface to be a sensible, rational approach to public sector decision-making. We want outcomes to increase. Therefore, we should tie your assistance to those outcomes. Moreover, such OBA, output-based aid as it sometimes is called, is seen as the way governments can make privatized educational services accountable to the public. So if you do go to vouchers, you can use OBA to make vouchers accountable, schools accountable to the public. In this paper, I talk about why what seems sensible and rational is not. I talk about 4 areas: public sector budget reforms, performance contracting, merit pay for teachers, and the use of standardized testing. So I'm going to start with budget reform. Just a few words about budget reform. In the US and elsewhere, there have been reforms to tie budgets to outcomes, just like the neoliberals want. There's a famous one in the 60s and 70s called PPBS, Program Planning Budgeting Systems, PPBS. We've seen more recent incarnations, zero-based budgeting, performance budgeting, and others. The idea has been to change what in budgets are financial analysis to an analysis of costs of programs. Secondly, to break down budgets by programs to be evaluated, most budgets are by funding categories. They're not by the programs we want to evaluate. You don't have a separate budget for every program you're evaluating. You've got budgets for broad categories of funding. So this idea was to break down the budgets by programs, tie costs to the budgets, and include measures of output, and tie the cost to the output. This sensible and rational approach has proved to be impossible to implement. Impossible. Cost analyses require very different analyses than financial analyses, so that the accounting approach to budgets don't work. When you really want to find out what are the costs of this program, you need a detailed study of that program. You don't just put together budget. There's costs that are not in the budget. There's costs that are in somebody else's budget. Budgets don't contain that, and it proved impossible to reform them to do this. Budgets are hard to tie to specific programs. They're tied to funding categories, not to specific programs that you want to evaluate. And it's proven impossible to tie outcomes to costs. That's why there's a whole field called program evaluation. That's why program evaluation exists, is to do these types of studies. They are not something you can simply put in a budget mechanically. So these budget reforms have proven politically very unpopular, and their simplistic and mechanical nature make them poor substitutes for careful and thoughtful evaluation of programs. Secondly, performance contracting. Then I'll get to merit pay after performance contracting. The principal form of OBA envisioned in neoliberal discussions of increased privatization is this idea of performance contracting, by which the public sector contracts with a private sector organization to provide a service. In the US, this was tried in the 1970s and was a failure. From the mid-1990s to the present, we have another era of simplistic accountability. Performance contracting is once again being tried out for the same reasons on a very small scale. Most prominent is a private for-profit firm, Edison Schools, that has been contracted by schools to take over the operation of low-performing schools in a number of cities throughout the US. Edison has aggressively marketed its services. It's remained small until recently, with the pro-privatization climate, has given it maybe 1,000 schools across the country. While Edison claims academic success, every external evaluation I have seen points out that their claim is based on inaccurate and misleading statistical analysis. There's a lot of research debates. There's research debates about the evidence I just gave you. There's research debates about Edison. To the contrary, external evaluations report mediocre performance, with Edison students doing no better than competent students in public schools. The failure of performance contracting, as embodied in Edison's failure, to improve academic achievement is perhaps the most telling indictment of output-based aid or outcomes-based education, and an especially devastating impact of education vouchers and privatization. Why? The benefits of greater reliance on private schooling is predicated on the responsiveness of the market to consumer demand. With performance contracting, you have a clear and strong test of the ability of the private sector to respond in education. The private organization, Edison, is basically given one and only one straightforward goal: increase test score, and is still unable to do that any better than the public schools. Yet the public, and this isn't just true for Edison, there's other research on other private contractors throughout the US. And public schools are trying to improve student achievement. They also have to be responding to the many goals of parents, communities, and providing education, often along with health, welfare, policing, and other services. With all this pressure to serve so many needs, public schools still produce an achievement gain, not a great one for these schools, the low-performing schools, but still perform an achievement gain equivalent to a private firm that has the outcome